Hey, Danielle.
Hey, trying to get this to work out.
Hmm, How is France?
Lovely.
Hmm,
Of course.
How's the weather? Good?
It's beautiful. Yeah, it's been amazing. Yeah. Um, we had a beach day today, so that's
That's
how
nice.
nice it's been. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's about 6 o'clock right now, right? At night?
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. Sorry, that math is easy for me because of my family. So I'm always like, have to think in my head what time it is in Europe when I'm calling my
Right.
mother or my sisters. So,
I understand. Oh,
okay, that's good. Well, thanks for hopping on, even though you're like halfway around the globe somewhere.
as long as it's not like 3 a.m., it's fine. Like
Yeah,
this is
I
easy.
I get that. Okay, we have a little bit time, I think, for um everybody else to join in and then to log in. I think it starts at 9, so it'll be good.
Okay. Yeah, I want to make sure that all of this like
It's working.
worked. Yeah. Kind of got a little shoebox set up here, literally.
Are you staying in a hotel or are you staying in like a
It's an
vacation home or
apartment.
something? Oh, nice. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes it better when you're there for an extended amount of time.
Yeah. I was meeting family, so they're here too. So
Nice. Yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
that sounds great.
Yeah. It's been I feel like this trip has been in planning for a long time and then it finally all of a sudden happened. I was like, oh right, yeah. And I feel like there's
Hmm.
so much going on right now too with like grant applications and RFPs and everyone's like it's like the worst timing ever, which I could not have anticipated.
Sometimes you need to prioritize yourself too. Ah, it's important, right? So
Yeah, totally.
otherwise you're gonna get nuts. Tell me
Yep.
about it.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, relatable from I guess the last year has been a little city recovery.
Yeah.
I
So
finally feel less burnt out.
that's good.
Yes.
Okay.
Just
Well,
waiting for
I'm glad.
Cole.
Cole and Jason, hopefully. And yeah, and then we wait. I think everybody's set up to join and
Yeah.
ask questions and share. So I think um
Okay.
there's Cole.
Here we go. Okay. Figure out the views.
Hey guys, I'm Juan Garza from Denver.
Hey, how are you,
Hey.
Juan? Cole?
Doing well.
Hey, good morning and good afternoon,
Mm,
and maybe good evening for you, Danielle.
Yes.
Good morning.
Morning, Gil. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Good. Just wanted to make sure you're all set, Tobias.
I think we're good.
Perfect. I'm not going to be staying on the call, but just want to make sure you're all set starting off
Yeah,
and
perfect. Thanks.
have a great meeting.
Thanks. We'll give it a little bit time until just after 9 for people to log on, and then we just gonna get going. we're waiting for one panelist to join, and we give it a little bit more time for other people to join on, probably until about like 9:03 or 4, and then we're gonna get going here. Just wanted everybody to know. So. Okay. Jason is here too. That's great. Probably was my fault using wrong emails in communication. Good morning, everybody. My name is Toby Marks. I'm the Parking Services Division Manager in the city of Bend. I'm also a board member for SWAPTA. And I'm glad that you're joining us this morning for this fun little panel discussion on curb management. I hope you can all see my screen. So this is give you a little bit of logistics. We are going to talk about curb management, what it means. The idea really is to have this more ground level conversation, because the word curb management is being thrown around a lot these days. And I think in my personal experience, when we a couple months ago started a municipal parking code modernization project, and I started talking to our teams about curb management and the need for that, everybody's was very lost to understanding what that actually means. And I don't think those were, of course, not like parking or mobility professionals. Those were like our legal teams and our procurement folks and our senior analysts. They were just like, well, parking is this. And so we thought this would be great actually to talk about this more, to open up the conversation about what that means. For this webinar, I'm joined by 3 wonderful people. We have Danielle Elkins, and I will let everybody introduce themselves in a second, but I'll just give you the rundown. We have Danielle Elkins, who runs a very nice consulting agency out of the Bay Area called Civic Ideation. We're joined by Jason Sutton from Duncan Solutions and Cole Jallet for Passport Labs. Danielle, tell us a little bit about yourself before we dive in.
Sure. Danielle Elkins. I run Civic Ideation LLC and focus on kind of bridging the gap between engineering, technology, and local government. I previously was with the city of Minneapolis and developed their mobility team and worked on a lot around curbside management. And previously served on the board for OMF, so have also a link to the data side of this as well.
Thanks. How about you, Jason?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jason Sutton. I'm the SVP of Parking and Mobility at Duncan Solutions. I've been in the parking industry for over 20 years, and through that time have started way early on in the operational side of things, being an enforcement officer. Had the pleasure of working with Cole and sometimes Danielle over the last few years while I was at Passport, really focused on what curb management means, what the definition is, and how it can be applied. Currently, I'm at Duncan Solutions and really focusing on the compliance aspect of curb management.
And Cole.
Hey, good afternoon, good morning, good evening for some. Cole Gillette, VP of Product here at Passport, where I'm responsible for the products that we develop, the design, the look and the feel, as well as our marketing function. So a lot of interaction with the market and lots of conversations about curb management. So I'm happy to be here.
Thanks. So what are we going to talk about today? So we're having there's an agenda, but it's really a very loose agenda for me to moderate the conversation between these three really fantastic professionals. So we're talking a little bit about what the definition of curb management for each individual person is, then like how that looks or what people can or cities can actually do to digitally defining the curb, activities that are actually happening at the curb, because I think we sometimes underestimate that. Little nuance here is like at the city of Bern, we just did a new right-of-way code, and we're promoting that as a code that manages what happens on the sidewalk and on the street. We're not talking about the curb at all. It has nothing to do with mobility at all. It's just like, actually, it's a franchise code. But so I think learning the different activities is really important. Optimizing curb policy with data, then the role of parking in curb management, because that's always interesting. I think that's shifting a little bit. And then the opportunities that curb management actually brings to the parking industry. Having said that, it's probably going to be a fun, not too long conversation, and then we make some room for questions at the end. If you have any questions in between, feel free to put them in the chat. Not sure that I'm smart enough to get to them, but we'll probably get to them at the end. So let's start with Danielle. Danielle, for you, what is curb management?
When we had this conversation in Minneapolis, I think what was really helpful was to look at what is the current state of the curb? What does it look like now versus 10 years ago? So now when you think about what's happening at the curb and curbside management, you're thinking about it's not just parking, it's access for all different types of vehicle, all different types of goods. You now have your DoorDash, your Amazon, you have paratransit, you have transit, you have micromobility, you have bikes and scooters, and have space for those things. And so it is thinking about holistically, now that you have exponentially more things competing for a finite amount of space, how do you manage and deal with the fact that we are only going to have more and more potential users and uses of people and goods at the curb? How do you use it efficiently, and also to reflect the goals of the jurisdiction that you're in? So if you're the city, how do you make sure that the city's goals are then reflected by how you're giving space, managing space, pricing space along the curb?
Thanks. Jason, want to chime in, or Cole?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. And I think really appreciate Danielle's kind of broadness of the curb and how comprehensive it is. I think in a lot of the conversations that I've had with cities over the last few years, when they think about a curb management strategy, and a lot of times this is coming down from stakeholders thinking about how their city's functioning, what the community's like, they get really kind of stuck on pieces of a curb management strategy. So focus on loading zones, or focus on paid parking, or focus on congestion. But I think what Danielle's identified here is just really the amount of players and how dynamic it is and how often it could shift, right? And whether that is because there's an entry of technology, there's new things that the industry is coming up with, or just within a jurisdiction or market, you're having new players enter, and it's causing, new challenges for how that curb's managed. I think one of the things that I had been watching over these last few years is just this abstract notion of curb management. And I've always felt like it didn't have to be this. It could be really well defined, as a curb is linear. And I think some of the work, and I'll let Cole speak to this, but really when we think about developing a curb management strategy or an approach to curb management strategy, we really need to kind of get down to the basics and what does that curb look like? And so Cole, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how you guys approach defining the curb, and then maybe some of the ways you look at building on top of that inventory infrastructure.
Yeah, and I'll keep it higher level because Toby, I know you've got a couple sections later on that get into that. But when we think about curb management at Passport, through the hundreds of conversations we've had with our customer base, a lot of it comes down to how do I manage all of the constituents that use in some way, shape, or form the curb, and ultimately, how do I optimize policy so that I can better support them? And in order to do that, there are some fundamental things that need to take place. And one of those first things is I need to know what I have. And that's where the digitization comes into play. If I don't know where my various assets live, then how am I actually going to be able to start to gain some insight around their use and ultimately go through that optimization process? The other piece to that that supports it in those early stages is having components in place that ensure you can provide the flexibility for the varying use cases. We've seen through COVID and other events that there's a lot more demand occurring, but that's not going to stop. It's just growing exponentially. So building an environment where you can have that stable foundation to support the various use cases becomes really key as part of those early stages.
So quick question that pops to my mind. So why, as a parking guy, right? So why go through all the effort and drama to change something that we basically have already done for years in the parking industry, which is managing parking, and have to redefine it as something new, which is called curb management? Because at the end, sorry, I'm probably jumping now between all these slides that we have prepared, but like at the end, parking people have managed parking at the curb for years, right? And I feel for often we think, well, now there's new devices, so we manage that. It's just another parking session. So why the need for calling it curb management?
I'll jump in real quick before I turn it over to Danielle and Jason. And I think really for me, curb management is just broadening what we used to refer to as parking management. Parking is one of the really key components to that broader view. And it is a necessity because without paid parking, how do you start to manage what's going on in terms of use? But there's so much more that's now occurring that referring to it as something parking or enforcement specific isn't covering all these new use cases.
Who wants to add something? I think Danielle wants to add something to that.
I think what a lot of forced this conversation is that we kept having so many issues of conflicts between parking, traffic operations, and planning and design as we were redesigning roads to add in bike lanes to try and increase safety within the streets, which took away potentially from curbside space at times or shifted the way the operations were going to work. And we kept getting into these conflicts between the different groups within we were public works in Minneapolis. And so it forced the conversation of we are having so much change rapidly, and we didn't have a way to talk about it, one, internally in a way that everyone understood it, was on the same page, and we could come to a consensus on how we should be moving forward on design, on operations, and maintenance. But we also didn't have a way to talk about it with our external stakeholders. So building property managers who are saying, why is the curb outside my building such a mess now? Are you guys causing this? Instead of being able to have a conversation and say, we have a new world of what is happening at our curb, and now we need to have a conversation with you about how we need to allocate the space differently. We need to price the space differently. We need to talk to you maybe about your loading zones or how you've been paying probably below rates for your commercial space for a very long time. It no longer makes sense. Like, the only way we could have these conversations and be able to explain this changing world was to frame it in a new way, I think.
I think just to piggyback, because I agree with both Danielle and Cole on this one, a couple of things that have kind of changed that parking management to curb management conversation. I think a big one would be technology, right? The idea that we are building tools that allow us to do much more downtown when it comes to how we, define that inventory, or how we regulate parking, or the ways in which we get people to participate with a parking program, whether that's through permit programs, mobile apps, just the way that cities distribute information. And then I think there's a expectation. I think over, so many years, and I think it was amplified within COVID, there's an expectation from folks in a community, whether they're the motorists, whether they're the business owners, whether they're the stakeholders, that their city functions better. And I think they're, looking at something much more than just, I need you to go out and charge for parking and write parking tickets. It's how do you get traffic from A to B much simpler? Or how do you have folks deliver goods to certain areas of the city? How do you accommodate special events? How do you accommodate rideshare TNC? So I think all those things have played into where we've evolved to as far as the conversation around what is curb management and how do we successfully do curb management.
Yeah, I think that resonates with me. And I think moving into this understanding the activities on your curb, right? We mentioned this a little bit, like everybody in the opening statement, that it's changing a little bit. But how do you feel? Interesting thing is also like what Danielle said, like, are you, like when somebody said, are you causing that, right? And that, are you causing that? Now, if we put this on the same level with all the conversations we have these days about parking minimums, parking mandates going away, that's something, I mean, we did this here locally already in the beginning of the year, and now everybody's freaking out, right? Where do people park? And then we wake up one morning after a restriping process and entire parking spaces are gone along a stretch of road, like you said, Danielle, because now there's a bike lane. I didn't even know about it, right? And so how to manage that? So what's that, besides like micromobility, what are the activities and the curb that we feel have changed and will actually going to change in the next couple of years in the context of parking minimums? And what's the opportunity then to actually have curb management as a strategy to address that?
I think, Toby, you can certainly identify with this, talking about some trees around the holidays, but also Danielle, working in
That
City
was
Hall.
not fair right now.
The conversation in the city or a conversation with downtown, when it becomes anecdotal, it's very hard to resolve, right? And the idea of getting data off of your curb and really understanding how your curb is being utilized or what's actually happening, I think helps align that conversation for the folks who are impacted and the stakeholders who make those decisions. And so I think, it can't be underestimated, the idea of how we collect data within a curb management strategy. And we use that for education, for insight, visibility, transparency, and then ultimately the decision-making part of that. When it comes to, just the dynamics of a downtown city, I think it's that split between understanding your inventory, understanding how it's performing. So as you do have a disruptor, positive or negative, that you're able to accommodate that. You're able to look at what that impact is having as it's occurring. You're able to make decisions about how to manage that and put that into a part of the program that actually functions well or solves a problem for a city, or just really can let stakeholders know what's going on. And I think that maybe goes back a little bit to some of this idea of why is parking important in this, is because parking is on that curb on a daily basis. They have folks who are monitoring it. They have folks who are enforcing it. They are kind of the eyes and the ears of what's currently happening. And so I think that's why there's a pivotal role for parking to be involved here.
Yeah, I think the interesting part, we've had this conversation before of like the on-street versus off-street parking as well. We were finding that consistently the off-street parking that exists is underutilized. And there's a perception that there's no parking. The reality is there's less parking maybe potentially on the curbside, but there's still an abundance off-street that could handle the demand, or the off-street loading zones could be and should be handling more of the demand. But there's a lot of missing in terms of education. If you have the data, you can say, look, there's not space here, but there is space right here. This is what you should be doing. You need to change your behavior to make your life easier as well.
Yeah.
I can kind of thread the Jason and Danielle's points and just speak to the fact that, a lot of conversations around understanding activity were initially rooted in, hey, there's all this change that is happening exponentially, and we need a way of understanding it. But that way of understanding was not timely. So the minute you'd go to make the case of, hey, this is happening at my curb, it's already outdated and you're getting pushback. So the trend that I'm seeing happening at the moment is, okay, what are ways of getting that data in real time? But the notion of let me do this in an isolated fashion isn't necessarily remaining suitable, because we are looking to off-street and all these different forms of paid parking now. So the trend that I'm starting to see is, how do we leverage technology to look holistically and kind of blend ways of hardware versus predictive modeling so that I can get that good picture of what is happening in a timely sense so that I can start to make pointed decisions and have some confidence in the conversations that I'm having to optimize those policies.
I did want to just pick up on something that Danielle said, which is, I think, a great insight and something that she had experienced was when we think about a curb management plan or a curb management strategy, it needs to be inclusive. And so Danielle mentioned talking about how you work with internal city stakeholders and all these different departments. We definitely understand the businesses and the patrons. But as you think about the balance between on-street and off-street inventory, a city may not have a ton of access to their off-street inventory that may be held by private companies or other things. And so how does a city welcome folks in, or convince folks to come and participate, and that there's value into that, and that idea of a blended downtown inventory, as it can take pressure off of the curb and allow for certain kind of uses. So I think that is also something when we think about curb management, instead of just the kind of activity that's happening along the curb, it's really that downtown community network that needs to be a part of that, and how cities are actually opening up their doors and reaching out and trying to get people to come in and participate.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, because I think like when we did our parking plan, like our downtown strategic parking plan in like 2017, of course it calls for shared parking, right? We identified, in addition to the 2,500 parking spaces we have in our downtown core, we identified, I think, another 1,500 parking spaces that are private, that are not utilized and used after 5 p.m. any given day, right? And our parking committee went out and approached everybody. Nobody wanted to do it. And so no private entity wanted to do that. Now, fast forward a few years, now we're finding ourselves having conversations on the municipal code level, where we want to create code language that allows for shared opportunities, where we would potentially enforce that as a city entity, right? Where a private entity could add that into the mix because of what you just said, and I think that's true. Moving into like actually real results of like optimizing curb policy, because I think that's an interesting one for me, because I feel often it's like, well, it's working, why change it, right? Like, we're already doing this, so what's the deal? But in my real-time experience, and I think this might be an interesting conversation to have, full disclosure, we did launch like a parking guidance system in December 2023. There is a story about tree lights and trees that Jason mentioned that would be really fun to share right now, but we're not going to get into this because I'm too embarrassed to share it. However, what we have seen consistently since we turned that program on in the middle of December 2023 is that we actually now have a use case to guide people into the off-street available parking better, faster, and it's kind of like taking the edge away in the conversation about, well, parking is difficult in downtown. Because parking is difficult in downtown, that statement usually comes from, I wanted to go to this little store and I couldn't find parking right in front, right? And so now that made it inconvenient. And so we have seen since, which is interesting, and more context maybe for everybody on the call who doesn't know that, we have our downtown core in Bend, Oregon is very busy. We have about 1,500 on-street spaces and about 900 off-street parking spaces. It's 2-hour parking, like you will see in any downtown core anywhere in the country, basically, or give or take a little. And we have seen since a little bit more, sorry, our only paid parking is our parking garage, 500 spaces, and our remaining off-street lots. On-street is still free. And since December, we have consistently seen an increase of about 26 to 28% in paid parking transactions, month over month compared year by year, in our off-street locations. And since we turned on the parking guidance, which is interesting, but that could be just, okay, just maybe that's just a fluke. But we actually have issued 12.5 and sometimes 15% less citations month over month than we had before. So those numbers together actually show that this is a great example for optimizing curb policy with real data to like, okay, this is what's available right now. But if you go here, you actually find parking quicker. And it also shows that in general, people are willing to pay if they can, right? Because it's only $1 an hour. So who really, not many people care. So a great example actually for what we've said that can work. But what else? Maybe this is a Danielle and no, it's an everybody's question, but like what else is a great example, or how could we optimize the curb or curb policy with data that you can actually collect, right? And then if you do that more in real time, because Cole's already mentioned, often we did like parking studies, right? They give us a snapshot of a certain time frame, and then we want to change policy in the future based on what we collected 6 months ago. That's not ideal. So what is another example of how we can optimize curb policy by understanding the data that we can collect better? And second question to that actually is, I think parking people will get that very quickly, actually, because they're generally smart. But how do you convince other people in your, especially in a municipality, how do you convince your legal team? How do you convince your right-of-way manager that what you're actually talking about is real? And before I let you answer that, a great example, somebody mentioned loading before, right? There are still people in our city that feel we do not need loading zones because we have alleys and it's never an issue. Well, yesterday morning, most streets in downtown between 8 and 9 were blocked by semi-trucks for like about 45 minutes or an hour. You couldn't get through because in every direction, right? So I think, so how do we transition from that internal parking conversation where we actually built this case and bring other people on board to optimize our curb policy and stuff? Any thoughts on that?
I think I can take the first part and I'll let Danielle and Cole speak a little bit to the second part. But when it comes to using data to influence policy, I think, Toby, you as the parking director for the city of Bend really have 3 levers that you can pull to kind of, affect how your curb is behaving. And that could be inventory, duration, or rate. And so by looking at the data, you can see, in specific areas, what the demand is, what the occupancy looks like, how the curb is actually working. And it might lead you to make a recommendation to the city to say, look, we need to increase rate, or we don't have enough spaces, or we need additional loading zones, or things like that. And so I think that's one way that you can actually successfully pull those levers. And in my mind, it isn't maybe just pulling a lever, it's a combination of those levers. And it could be block by block how they work. And so I'll let Cole and Danielle pick up on the second half there.
I just keep thinking about the attorney question. We were really lucky that I had a great group of attorneys at the city, and it was never, no, you can't do that. It was, you can't do that because of this, but if you fix this, then you can do that. And so the conversation then became, okay, do we need to update city ordinance? Do we need to go to the state legislature to get allowance to do certain things that made sense within our space? And, sometimes it takes multiple years, and rewriting and negotiating state statute changes with rural legislators who don't understand what city parking looks like. But eventually we were able to get a lot of the things we wanted to get accomplished through the state legislature, through city ordinance updates, getting a new pricing kind of strategy and rate schedule updated within city ordinance, getting it through council. And, it took a lot of educating and a lot of understanding policy and government affairs and how to advocate for the things that you're trying to accomplish. But as long as you can find people that are helping you to get to the yes, even though it might be a no now because of whatever is in current code, I think it's possible.
I like to think about, if I kind of boil things up from a curb management perspective, it is this never-ending cycle of digitize, understand, optimize. And in thinking about curb management in that way, it is in anybody's best interest to take a sliver of the overall curb management challenges you're facing and run that sliver through that model. And what that could look like, if I take one of Jason's levers as an example, if I want to pull the lever of duration, okay, I'm going to need to understand occupancy as a basis. And through making the case that we don't understand what that occupancy currently looks like, if you can get some budget in order to get some things in place, you can start to observe what is going on. And now you can start to iterate on those observations to inform policy change. So maybe it's that we're seeing a lot of overstay happen. And through compliance, I can start to pull some levers to say, let's try, X, Y, or Z out. And because I have that real-time observation occurring, now I can start to see what's working to then go advocate for iterations of that policy change. And that's where, there's plenty of metrics you can pull on that, but I think having that holistic thought of curb management, but taking it in more digestible chunks is where you start to see success, because as we all know, if I look at the topic of curb management as a whole, it is a very meaty thing, and it quickly becomes overwhelming if I don't kind of break things down into those pointed use cases.
So what would be a good metric that you would collect?
I think initially I would just want to look at duration of stay. And as some time goes by, where I get a sense of what that average duration looks like, as well as how that's broken down, let's say by zone, that's where I can start to maybe apply a policy change, maybe in one zone, and I can start to look at duration of stay, as well as the compliance side of it. What is paid versus non-paid look like? Am I writing an excessive amount of tickets in a certain zone? And that's where, I can start to pull some of those levers to see how I can drive better compliance. And if I can do that, that means that now I've proven out I can manage in that one pointed area the activity that's going on, and I can start to extrapolate that out.
Got it.
I think what Cole is describing too, Toby, I think to something that you said of why fix it if it's not broken, is the passive versus progressive management of the curb, right? And so if you're a parking manager, parking director, and your judgment of whether it's working or not is you're not getting any complaints, maybe isn't the best way to be progressive about how you manage your curb. But if you're looking at things of hotspots of violations and saying, you know what, there's 2 blocks of my city that are twice the amount of violations as all the other blocks. I need to go out there and see what's going on. Is the signage correct? Are the rates correct? Is the duration correct? Like, why is this happening? We shouldn't be penalizing folks. We're trying to make it easier for them to park. And it's the same thing as, why is the overstay? Why is the duration? Is it because the businesses on this block need more time than what the duration currently allows? I think that's really key for the success, is that you have people who are engaged on a daily basis. And again, going back to the idea of this is in parking's kind of world, because typically they are there and they should be a part of the community.
I think they understand those operational pressures too, that also can then re-inform back to the planning team, who is maybe trying to do some redesigns and doesn't have the full picture of what is happening on a given block. Maybe they understand the adjacent land use. Maybe they understand that there is, from the mobility team, that there's really high micromobility use or transit use on that block, but they don't know that there's a lot of double parking, and there's an apartment building that constantly is parking moving vans in this space. Like, there's so many additional things that can help you in the design perspective, that operations that should be informing design, that I think are also really helpful. That if you can make the case to planning, if you give me more data to help you defend the design or better inform the design, so that at the tail end you have then better operations and better mans.
So how do you then, I love what you just said, Danielle, and there might be some personal connection to a project that we're working on here right now, but so how then do you convince the engineer that just designed a road diet on a major thoroughfare like roadway and completely ignores all that?
Then you show them the data on why it didn't work and how you should stop doing that and not do. I think we're, coming from I used to be a transportation engineer. So I like to think that we talk so much about context sensitive solutions. Well, what about the context of operations of is this actually working? Is your design making sense? Is it helping you meet the goals that you are saying you're trying to meet in terms of safety, efficiency, prioritizing modes in your modal hierarchy, is it actually getting you the results that you want? And we had a lot of really difficult conversations with the city of conflict of what our engineers wanted versus what our planners wanted versus what was actually happening on the ground. And we unfortunately had a lot of designs happen, and then we went, that isn't working. So how do we now change it now that the design is done to fix it? And also, can we just learn from this and not make the same mistake going forward? How do we use this, extra data we have, the understanding of the operations, to make sure that we're not making the same mistake again, and at least being, aware of, okay, the adjacent land use made it so that it didn't make sense here, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to make sense maybe a block over and in another context within the city. But how can we change our process to have the operations better inform design?
Yeah, 100% agree. Which is actually the reason why we talk more about curb management, right? Because most of the engineers and planners, they think only from the transportation network perspective. Okay, so we want to do a road diet here because of XYZ, safety this. They don't consider the curb as being actually a valuable asset. They just feel that is just that just comes with it, right? And if parking needs to go away or this needs to happen, that's just what it is. Where if we can look at this more holistically and establish that more as a pillar, like curb management more as a pillar that needs to be considered, we can actually build better functional
maybe there are some
roadways
streets
altogether
that are all parking, and then the next parallel street over is where your bike lanes are or
Correct.
where your transit lanes are, so that you're eliminating the conflicts.
Yeah, I agree. No, I know some people that should have heard that.
Well, I think, Toby, like, this is one of those, really big challenges to, developing and executing a curb management strategy in any city.
Yep.
And we've sat on the panel before, and we've actually talked about, from a parking director's standpoint, what are the challenges that you face as it relates. And I think we did talk a lot about city politics, right? And the idea of how do you build consensus across departments, but also when you work in a city, you're having elections every 2-4 years. So you're having people come in with new ideas or new direction. And so there's an education component, hey, we've already started this project, all those types of things. So I think that can't be understated in the idea of how you successfully put something in that would be a long-term program that doesn't get derailed every time you have a new group of stakeholders.
Yeah, I agree.
If I can make any recommendations to someone who's thinking about undertaking creating a curbside policy or strategy, it's create multidisciplinary groups to work together to come up with what those policies are. In the very beginning, get the buy-in before you even start, and make sure that it's not just parking making the decisions, or traffic or planning or design. It has to be everybody in these multidisciplinary groups that are talking about all of their problems together in a room and coming to consensus, and starting off with this common definition and common goal of what are you trying to accomplish by this? What are your priorities as a city, and why are you even doing this? Because if you can't get agreement before you even start, it's going to be next to impossible.
Yeah, no, good point. So, hey, Graham, can you mute yourself? All right, we'll continue. So this will be interesting to, let me see if I can send him a message. One moment. All right, so now transitioning to the role of parking in curb management, and I liked what Jason said about the active and passive management, right? And I think we all feel that we are very active, but this might be an unusual example, but in our micromobility bike share program, we just transitioned to implement a mobility manager tool. And so we have a 2-year pilot program, and that pilot program has been great, but we did get, of course, a lot of complaints about bikes being left random corners, blocking ADA access ramps, that kind of thing. Now that we have the mobility manager, I can see every bike at every moment of time where it is. And I have some policies that are telling me, hey, okay, so this bike, we have some policies. One says, if a bike is parked for 72 hours or longer, we address it. And we're pulling out that data and we are sending it to our operator in the morning every day. And we have now, I mean, it's still early in the season. It's only June. We basically picked back up in April. But compared to the last 2 years early season, we're getting a fraction of the complaints than we got before, because through this tool now our fleet managers and our operators are able to get to the bikes quicker, right? So they understand the rules and our desires and our expectations better, which is great. And so that was just an example for passive to active, because we have been passive on this in the past, right? We're like, well, we hands off, it's not our responsibility. But now that 30 minutes of a day actually reviewing this has a major implication, and that's where I think we're more active. So that's a good thing. So now the role of parking in curb management. So I had a conversation, I think it was Cole, I think it was with KG about that, like about enforcement, right? And enforcement has this, because we are parking people, for us, enforcement is normal. For everybody outside the industry, enforcement is just mean, right? It's just punishment. It's just a money grab. But so, and KG said that, well, when we talked about this, we realized enforcement is like the foundation even for curb management in the future, right? And before I let you guys talk about that, I feel, and my bike advocates locally don't really like me for that, but I feel eventually we don't only need to enforce parked cars and trucks for loading. Eventually we need to come to the point where we may also enforce other devices, like micromobility devices, like scooters or bikes, because if you're creating designated parking spaces for that, shouldn't we then also have parking rules for that? What are your thoughts? Who wants to go?
I mean, Cole, I'll start. I didn't know if you wanted to jump in here, but I agree. And I think probably what we see is a legacy perception of enforcement, right? The idea that it's punitive. And I think what you had pointed out as far as your wayfinding and the incorporation of off-street inventory and being able to direct people to the most appropriate space resulted in less violations. And that's a positive thing. That's one of those metrics that's probably something you should be looking at to say, look, we need to reduce the number of citations. It creates happy customers. It means compliance is up, and we're not having to deal with a whole lot of headache. But I do think that we need to change the way that we think and talk about enforcement and really relate it to compliance. It's not punitive. It's not about revenue, but it is about those levers and those policies that you put in place don't really work that well when people disregard them or abuse them. And, when you have a duration that's, decided because you've looked at the data, you understand the curb use, the demand generators, and you say it's a 2-hour zone. If somebody wants to park there for 6 hours, it kind of breaks the system down, right? It creates a level of inefficiency in the way that your curb management strategy works. So there is an element of a curb strategy that requires to have compliance, just to make sure that things function the way they do. I think if we think of those rates, inventory, and duration as levers, you can think of enforcement as more of a dial. And I think that's dictated by market and community. You will have some communities where, I've worked in the past in operations that is very light on enforcement. They want enforcement really to be very friendly, more of a warning, more of a reminder, and they didn't have a lot of abuse in their system that was causing a big problem. But I've also worked in communities where they had a lot of issues, and whether it was the stakeholders' idea of parking in their city, or it was just needed because it needed to keep the program functioning, they had a much stronger push on the amount of enforcement that was needed. And so I think enforcement isn't one size fits all. I think it is something that needs to be fine-tuned as a part of being proactive. But nonetheless, I don't think we just have talked about it the right way in the past as part of its function and importance to what would be an overall curb management strategy.
I 100% agree with that. If I separate enforcement from parking for a second, parking to me plays a few different roles. There's parking in the traditional sense of, hey, it's a core means of mobility that ultimately takes place at the curb, and we need to manage that. And that, provides a lot of benefit, especially if you are going from a non-paid parking program to paid. But as we look at the evolution of the curb and, now embrace this curb management concept, parking still has its place in that traditional sense, but it also becomes a really key data source because it is one of the most prominent pieces of mobility that's happening at the curb. So as we reflect back on that whole digitize, understand, optimize, without parking playing a key role, you're missing a huge piece of insight that you need to ultimately optimize and influence policy. Where enforcement is interesting is, to Jason's point, I think it has been looked at maybe not always the right way, and it isn't a one-size-fits-all thing, but it ultimately really requires a clear understanding of what your goals are and what the dynamics are that are at play. And if you can understand those, align on those with your stakeholders, and start to implement an enforcement or compliance function within your environment, then you can start to use that as a lever to ensure, to what I said very early on, that you are building or promoting that flexible but maintainable environment, regardless of what constituents and use cases are coming into play. So I know this question was focused on parking, but I think you can't talk about parking without some form of that compliance coming into play as well.
I maybe want to add in a piece about the micromobility issue because we wrote a lot of tickets for scooters. We were having so many complaints and so many parking violations, particularly from certain neighborhoods, from a very small number of individuals, but it became a very serious issue where it put the entire program at risk. And the only way that we could start to have behavioral change is we instituted a warning system with all the providers, started issuing fines and tickets to the providers, and they had the choice whether or not to pass it on to the user. But we needed to start educating people on there are repercussions if you don't park your scooter or your bicycle properly within the right of way. On the same hand, it was also on the responsibility of the city to let them know where proper bike parking was and to provide enough proper bike parking in high demand areas so that they were also incentivized to do the good and correct behavior. So they're punishing, but you're also rewarding when they did the right thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And before we're almost at the end here, actually, I want to leave a little bit of time for questions if there are any. But I think that's it for me a little bit too, that I think traditionally we looked at parking to only be for cars. And then, of course, we included loading, and we consider that parking too. But I do think in the next couple of years, I think we are looking at other devices that we need to manage out of the parking divisions, the parking departments, whatever they are as well. And I think that's going to be a great role for technology partners too, to actually, okay, what are the identifiers that we're using for that, right? And so how do we do that? And so I think that's true. Now, having said that, and I think this is our last talking point. So maybe in one sentence. So in one sentence, what are the opportunities for the parking industry in the context of curb management?
I think I don't know if I can do it in one sentence, but I think, as a parking director, Toby, working for the city, you were in a position that you were figuring this out, very independent. Now, I know you're very involved in IPMI, you're very involved in SWAPTA, and you do a lot of networking, but I think a lot of cities are facing challenges and they're looking for how this actually works. So I think the networking education component is a huge thing that we can continue to promote from within an industry of getting people to come and participate. But I also think us as folks in industry can look at the way that we approach partnerships. And the idea that, Toby, you don't have to broker these and figure these partnerships out, but that organizations can work together to figure out how their solutions come together to really solve problems.
Yeah.
I'm going to piggyback on that slightly. Before I give my one sentence, Toby, I want to give a one sentence preface. I joined this industry because we are at this super interesting inflection point where we as a collective group of public and private sector have the opportunity to influence direction. And my answer to piggyback off of Jason is that the notion of a open ecosystem built upon relationship is where the opportunity lies. If we can collectively do that, get on board and align and know where, hey, this is where we win together, this is where we compete, regardless of whether we're talking about public or private, there's some really cool, interesting stuff that we can do to make the curve a better place and more manageable.
I'm hoping this doesn't come off too cynical. I don't want it to. I want this to be hopeful, but I think there's a misconception that if we don't change, the change will not impact us. And I think we are in the reality that there is so much change happening that unless you lean into it and decide how you want it to happen to you, you don't want it to happen to you. You want it to happen with you and in the way that you want it to evolve. And leaning into the technology and grabbing the things that will protect your programs, defend you, like you defending your programs, that is what is going to get the outcomes you want.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think those were all three interesting perspectives, but they're all tied together. It's like you can see them like in like a diagram with three circles together. In the middle is where it's at. Now, I think that's great. So, okay, so little bit more time. I think we have a couple more minutes. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for participating, Danielle, Jason, Cole. Thanks for everybody to joining us for this webinar. Are there any questions that you have? Like anything that we've said, any comments that you want to make? Are there any questions that you have that you would like to ask us? And you can put them in the chat, or you can just raise your hand, and you can unmute and ask it. That's that moment when you count to 12 to make sure that everybody has a chance. If there are no questions, great. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so, thank you so much
Hey
for
guys,
joining us.
can you hear me?
Yeah, go on.
I just
Go
want to
ahead.
jump in and say I appreciate you guys. You triggered me hard with this, especially coordinating with folks and how transportation engineering and planning and all that. That's what I'm dealing with right now, because I manage pretty much all the programs, micromobility, bike parking, valet, car share. And so, yeah, I'm definitely dealing with that right now. And it's kind of good to see that I'm not the only one, because sometimes you feel a little isolated trying to sell these folks on how important it is to have parking infrastructure to go along with these bike lanes that are coming in. I can't tell you how many times I've issued a valet permit or even the residential parking permit program, and they put a bike lane in, and it just, for valet or no more permit program. So, yep, you triggered me. So, thanks.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks. That's good feedback. And you can reach out to each one of us anytime if you have questions. So don't hesitate.
That was going to be my final word is, the idea of a networking community. I think, Toby, we hit on that a lot when we did a version of your podcast, Parking Happiness. But the idea that I've not really come across too many unfriendly folks in our business, and that, Juan, as you're kind of facing challenges, use your network. And I know Cole and Danielle and Toby and I are always around. You can send us an email, send us a text, visit us at a conference, things like that, and could help you potentially link up with another city that's facing the same types of challenges or has code that you might want to look at that you could maybe bring into your city, those types of things. So I think everybody should be encouraged to stay connected.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. And I always say that when we have these data conversations, there's so much happening around data with parking, with curbside, with micromobility. These are all really new concepts. They have only existed for, in some cases, less than 5 years, in some cases, less than 2 years. And anyone who says that they know everything about that is lying. And there is no stupid question at this point, because we are all figuring this out together, nationally, internationally, right now. So
Yeah.
there's no stupid question if anyone wants to.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't have said it as hard. No, I actually would have said it as hard as Danielle, but I think it's true. I think, like, it sounds so great to say like, well, yeah, you need to collect the data, but what, how, where, why? Answers that are very localized and unique, right? And I think we forget that it's not a cookie cutter approach. And so, yeah. Okay. Well, we're, I think, almost at the top of the hour. If there are no more questions, you can get the contact information for everybody through Swapta. I just want to remind everybody a little bit of like regular business. Swapta's annual conference is in October in Las Vegas, October 28th through the 30th. If that is your region, that's a great conference. It's a fun conference, very different than other conferences to attend. And I also encourage you to go to the Swapta webpage, southwestparking.org, to look up other webinars that are scheduled for July and August. There might be something that will be of interest to you. Having said that, I hope you guys all have a remaining great week. Thanks, Danielle, Jason, Cole, for joining me and Swapta for this panel. That was fun. It was a great conversation. And I hope you all enjoy yourself and have a great summer.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Yeah.